We promised we start at 3, so we're going to start at 3 o'clock.
Right.
Which is now. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone who's just logged in. This webinar is sponsored by the UC STEM faculty learning community. That is was started as an HHMI mini grant project that was coordinated with the 4 current UC grant holders in the HHMI 2014 Undergraduate Science Education Project. And the goals of this community, this learning community, is to promote research-based effective learning or education in STEM across the UC. And we do that in 2 different ways. One is having an annual meeting. Our first meeting was UCR, and then our second, that was a year and a half ago, and our second meeting was at UC Santa Cruz last October, and our next upcoming meeting will be at UCSB. But in between that, we do these series of webinars, and this is one of them. So I'm going to introduce the 2 speakers. It's Erin Palmer and Sabriya Rosemond from the College of Chemistry at UC Berkeley. And I'm going to hand it off to them and log off. I just wanted to talk a little bit about housekeeping. You can ask questions. There'll be, you can type. If you move your mouse around in the window, you'll find a Q&A option, and so please type questions into there. If you want to communicate with me, you can send a chat message. I'll be monitoring that as well, and then it breaks in the talk, I'll relay those questions to Erin or Sabriya. And then at the end, I don't think we're going to go the whole hour. If anybody wants to talk online with their webcam, ask questions, or discuss more about this topic, just raise your hand. There's an option to raise your hand, and I will turn on your ability to use your webcam. Okay, so with that, I'd like to introduce Erin and Sabriya, and I'm going to log off for the moment.
All right. Thank you so much, Rolf, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to speak about our work today. Over the last 3 years, we've been working with chemistry professor Angelica Stacy to redesign iteratively our general chemistry class. And what we're doing is trying to create a classroom system that attends to problems of social inequality, because as we know, if left unexamined, these things can undermine students' academic access and achievement. And as our title indicates, we've landed on a practice-based approach, which effectively invites students into authentic scientific practice in order to both develop a rich and connected understanding of general chemistry, and also invite more inclusive conceptions of what it means to do good science that support more of our students to see themselves as competent chemical thinkers. So just to give you a sense of where we're headed, we're going to talk about what we've learned from students and what we've learned from the literature that have informed our redesign. We'll share with you some design principles and how those principles have been instantiated in our work. And then we'll share with you some preliminary findings about what this work has made possible for students. So as educators, we want all of our students to be successful in STEM and to stay in STEM, and yet we know that some groups of students experience more success and choose to stay in STEM than others, and this is particularly true for our underrepresented minority students. If we look at 4-year and 5-year STEM major completion rates, we see disparity between underrepresented students and their white and Asian counterparts. And we also know that the highest rate of attrition for underrepresented minority students tends to occur in those first 2 years of their major when they're taking gatekeeper courses like general chemistry or organic chemistry. And this is true for us in Chem 1A, which is a 1-semester chemistry course for non-chemistry majors, so engineering students, pre-med students, life science students. And back in 2012, we were approached by the Office of Multicultural Student Development about concerns that Black students were leaving their STEM majors after their experiences in Chem 1A. And this office cited concerns that students were questioning their ability to be successful. And at the same time, I was mentoring a really talented young Black woman in this class who 3 weeks into the course after taking her first midterm got a pretty low score and texted me that she also was going to leave not only her major, but the university. She said to me, yeah, please, I think that science isn't for me. Like, I just don't feel smart enough to continue. And while there's lots that we can say about that, what struck me was how quickly, only 3 weeks in, she's connecting this grade to her smartness, and then her smartness to her lack of fitness for the sciences. And that led me to wonder what messages about smartness and science are available in the world for students to tap into and make sense of themselves. So we carried out focus groups and interviews to learn more about students, and we also dug into the literature. And what we found is that there are exclusive and narrow narratives about scientific brilliance that exclude most of our students. And I'm going to talk about that in 3 ways. The first is that STEM is this kind of high status field, right? People associate success in STEM with needing or requiring a particular or innate kind of brilliance, which is problematic because brilliance is both a racialized and a gendered construct. There's lots of education research that tells us that racial narratives that link ability to race, such as Asians are good at science or Asians are good at math, create these hierarchies of perceived ability that position our Black and brown students at the bottom, our Asian students at the top, and our white students as the invisible norm. And in interviews and focus group, students were both aware of these narratives, and our Black students in particular talked about experiencing racial microaggressions based on perceived lack of competence in the class. In addition, we looked at what counts in society as smart or what counts as good science. And these are also very narrow, right? Students are socialized to think of the chemistry student who learns effortlessly as brilliant or who often gets a lot of right answers as brilliant. So brilliance is constructed in ways that make it feel really scarce. And while these narratives are not necessarily constructed in our classes, they exist in the world, and our classes are organized in ways that make them sensible to tap into. So as we again learned from students and from literature, students tend to see general chemistry as a weeder or a weed out class. And this might feel benign to us, but when we probe students' sense making about this narrative, for them, this is a narrative about sorting by ability, right? So this class is here to show you whether you are part of the weeds who don't belong in the sciences or this up and coming crop of scientists who have the ability to be successful. And there are aspects about this design that make this narrative sensible. Things like high enrollment, high competition, the fast pace at which the course moves, the wide breadth of content, the language that gets used, which is often white, middle-class academic language, and also the organization of the pedagogy. You have a professor who's positioned as brilliant, this knowledge holder, and students not so. And in addition to this, when we look at how science is taught in our traditional classrooms, it's incongruent with the ways that science is practiced. And so we're framing science for students as school science, as this discrete body of facts, as content that's available to be memorized and unchanging. The learning is often individual. Whereas when we think about science as practice, it is a way of thinking. It's a diverse set of practices that we use to make sense of the world. It is collective, it's iterative and messy and creative. So what is problematic for us is that students are making decisions about whether to stay or leave STEM based on this idea of school science and not actually science as practiced. So this moved us to ask this large question: what would it look like to reorganize the entire system of our classroom toward equity and toward learning that reflects science as practiced?
So as we considered that question and in thinking about our large goal for reorganizing Chem 1A, what we settled on was an idea that we wanted to create a learning environment and a learning experience that socialized students into new ways of seeing and participating in science. We wanted to support students to develop a rich, connected, and relevant understanding of chemistry, so an understanding of chemistry that is more similar to the ways that chemistry and science are practiced. And we wanted to create a space where students were able to recognize and build on the many ways that they are already brilliant. So to do this, we used a set of organizing principles that helped us to shape and guide the development of our course design. So the first that I'd like to talk about is organizing curriculum around central ideas and practices of chemistry. For us, what this meant was revisiting and revising what we wanted students to learn, and also being clear about that for ourselves, and to move away from a curriculum that was solely content-focused to one that integrates content and practices. Next, we wanted to have a space that recognizes and leverages students' strengths and experiences. All of our students are brilliant, full stop, right? And they're coming with a diverse array of strengths and a diverse array of experiences, largely informed by their cultural backgrounds. And we wanted to publicly recognize these strengths and experiences and leverage them as a part of the learning that happens in the course as a means of inviting students into chemistry and into science as their full selves. Next, we really wanted to think about how we could engage and support students in collective chemical practice, because science and learning are best when they happen with multiple brains, right? You get to distribute the thinking, and it ultimately leads to richer understandings. And finally, we wanted to value and call out expansive and inclusive ways to be scientifically brilliant. And this particular principle is super important because we want to be pushing against those larger societal narratives about who and what counts as brilliant. In order to do that, we need to replace those things with new definitions of what it means to be scientifically brilliant. And as we continue to talk about design, what you'll see is that we define what it means to be scientifically brilliant, and we define that by engaging in scientific practices. So the first thing I'd like to talk about before we talk about the various parts of the course was really, settling in on what the big ideas are for the course. So overall, we decided that we wanted to focus on using potential and kinetic energy as a means of explaining macroscopic properties. Because we want students to consider how chemistry is relevant to their everyday life, macroscopic properties really allows us to do that, right? Like, how do we think about why things are hard or gas or solid, et cetera? But we also wanted to support students to understand how things were changing at the atomic scale. And so in the first unit, we talk about matter and understanding properties, and we introduce ideas of attractions and motions. In Unit 2, which is about energy, we're talking about changing attractions and motion. Unit 3, which focuses on equilibrium, is really about the competition between attractions and motions. And then finally, Unit 4, which focuses on spectroscopy, talks about how we can use light to modify attractions and motions, and support students to revise some of the ideas that got introduced in earlier units. So now we're going to talk a bit about how we design the in-class experience for students in that learning environment. And our goal here was really to support collective engagement and authentic thinking and practices. So just some general information, the class meets for 50 minutes 3 times a week. We had a multi-tiered instructional staff, so that included Professor Stacy, 2 graduate student instructors, about 7 undergraduate student TAs, and 2 researchers. And again, this course is for non-chemistry majors, so it included engineers, intended biology majors, and other pre-health intended students. We selected students for this class based on whether or not they had a year or less of high school chemistry or if they were repeating the course. So what this actually ended up meaning in terms of demographics of students in the course is that we ended up with an overrepresentation of students with marginalized identities. And finally, we had over 100 students, and we organized those students in groups of 4 to 5. And so the picture you see on the left is the space that we use. We're really fortunate that there is some space available on campus that allows this type of learning environment. And on the right is just sort of a view of how we organize the teams at these tables. So now that we've organized these teams, we really needed to be deliberate in thinking about what these teams will be doing. So we knew that we wanted an activity that was organized around the central ideas and chemical and practices, and we knew that we wanted it to be collective. And so we incorporated and built upon the larger ideas for the course and within a given unit. And because we want students to be engaged in practice, we knew that we wanted this activity to be data-centered. We also wanted this activity to leverage students' strengths. So to do that, we needed the activity to invite multiple ways of engagement, and for the final product of this activity to have multiple valid approaches. Finally, we didn't want this activity to be fully reliant on formal scientific language, both because, as mentioned, our students have a variety of high school chemistry preparations, but also we really want this activity to be about students learning concepts and wrestling with understanding those concepts, and not necessarily wrestling with understanding those concepts while they're simultaneously trying to remember new language for these concepts. So what we came to design are what we call chemical tasks. And now I'll walk you through the architecture of these tasks. So at the top is today's question, and this was just a central question. And creating this question as designers was really important because it forced us to think about what students should be learning in a given day. And for students, it signaled what they should be looking for as they engage in the task. The next section was just a brief overview of what the task would be. And for this task, the teams were asked to look at data on intermolecular force cards and determine some relationships between structure and boiling point. So here are 3 representative cards from the intermolecular force cards that, and we as a team worked to design these cards. And as you can see, these are for neopentane, isopentane, and pentane. There are multiple representations of these substances and a number of variables that students can draw from. And so in designing data that we were giving to students, we needed to make sure that they were complex enough to allow students to arrange and rearrange and to control for variables, while also making them accessible enough so the students could dive right into the activity. In addition to data cards, we also gave students data tables or images and animations and simulations throughout the semester to use as types of data. The next section of the task card was really designed to support students to work equitably as they were working with the data. So for here, we're asking students to, to divide the cards up and then work together to sort them, to examine the data on the cards, and to create groups and rearrange and create new groups and absorb and record what they see. For other tasks, students were asked to write rules based on observations, etc. So all of this work in this section was to support the creation of the team product, which we called bringing it together, right? For this task, students were asked to write 4 claims about how and why each variable relates to the changing boiling point. Other examples of team products were to use models that they developed in the previous section to predict something new, or to draw, to create a representative drawing to explain something to someone. So in addition to data and to the task cards, students were also provided with note sheets to support them as they moved through the task. So the note sheets outlined what the learning goals were for the day, and also provided graphic organizers that they could use to take notes and record their thinking as they engaged in the task. And so because we'd like to be as transparent as possible, as we go through, we're going to talk about some challenges that we faced, because while we were fortunate that many of our tasks were designed fairly well and students are engaging well in them, they are not easy. For starters, students are only doing these tasks for 40 minutes, so we had to be deliberate about thinking about what could they do in those 40 minutes that would allow for rich chemical thinking. Secondly, curating data and determining ways of presenting this data to students was difficult. And finally, we wanted the task to remain open so that students are actually engaging in explorative processes, but we wanted to do that without getting students lost, but we also didn't want it to be so hand-holdy that it didn't allow students to, mess up and make mistakes. So we can take some questions now, if there are any.
So far, there are no questions. If you came in late, if you want to ask a question, you can type it if you move your mouse, you should be at either the top or the bottom. You'll find a little button that says Q&A. You can type a question, and I will relay it to Erin and Sabriya. But so far, nobody has had the courage to type a question. So at least I don't see any so far. So I think they may occur, but I have some questions, but I'll save them for the end. So at this point, I think we can just keep going.
Okay. So to remind you, what we're trying to do is create this classroom system that is attending to issues of social inequality. And part of doing that work is trying to disrupt these traditional hierarchies of who gets seen as smart and who gets seen as not smart, and instead try to support more equal status interactions as students are working together on these tasks that require a high cognitive demand. And so as we move into this next section, I'm going to talk about some of the instructional strategies that we developed to communicate high expectations for students, to hold teams accountable to group thinking, and also how we intervened when status issues or inequitable participation arose. So first, we acknowledge that what we're asking of students is really different and a lot riskier than what they might be asked to do in a traditional science class. So we had to think about what is it that students are going to need to hear from us at the beginning of each task to support them to engage in the ways that we want them to. What we ended up doing is dedicating the first 5 minutes to introducing the task. We called that the task launch, and we settled on 3 things that felt important to do. If we're trying to build this connected and rich understanding of chemistry, we needed to spend some time situating the day's task and the sense-making that would occur in the context of all the sense-making they've already done so that they're ready to tap into it. The second thing we did is oriented them to the tools and the data that they would be working with. And the third item, which was really the bulk of our launch, was trying to reframe scientific thinking and learning. And we did this through something called the Smart Things List. And what this really was designed to do is create a more inclusive understanding of brilliance that was grounded in scientific practice. So for example, things that we would name for students to do: recognizing patterns in data, making connections to Coulomb's law, controlling for variables. So we're trying to name scientific practices so they have language to talk about that, and name those as the things that are competent or smart to be doing. We recognized that we needed to communicate to students that not knowing is actually vital to doing chemistry, that any kind of premature certainty is actually problematic, and that what we need students doing are considering multiple possibilities or explanations. We need students offering ideas that might turn out to not be right, that these are actually part of doing good science. And you'll notice on this list that there are many practices. And part of the reason for that was to say, hey, doing science requires a diversity of strengths, and not everyone in the room is good at all of these things, but everyone's bringing some of them. So you're really going to need your team to be successful with the task. So it's a way of supporting collective practice. So that was the first 5 minutes. Once students were working on the task, we gave them a shared set of data and a shared set of task cards to actually hold them accountable to group thinking. And we were looking to make sure that those cards were in the middle space. So if we saw that they weren't, if they were kind of huddling closer to one student, we'd either put them back in the middle ourselves or ask the students to do that and tell them why. In addition, we instituted a role called the team leader. This role was rotating, and the purpose of it was to hold students accountable for thinking together. Part of their job was to read the task card out loud, and that was to get the team started quickly, and also so that students could not only read directions, but hear them for those for whom that's supported. And second, we instituted a norm of a team question. And what that meant is that no individual on a team could ask an instructor a question unless they had collectively discussed it and come to some level of understanding about it first. So this slide is showing, an instructor asking the team leader, what is the team question? They're responsible for reporting it. And we were listening for this we language, collective language. So how do we know if something has dissociated or just dissolved? If the team leader could not voice what the team question was, then the instructor left and said, why don't you talk about that question, come back, and then share your thinking about it so far. And the reason that this role was rotating is we wanted to distribute the power of that role among the team. So if someone was maybe a little quieter or not naturally inclined to be the one talking to the instructor, well, they were eventually going to get there. While students worked on the task, all of the instructional staff was walking around and listening for the interesting connections and questions that were coming up in teams and making those contributions public by recording them on whiteboards that were positioned around the room. And the reason for doing that was to support students to recognize that questions, connections, these contributions of theirs counted as really smart chemistry. And so it was part of our way of kind of expanding what was valued in the class. And also it supported to push other groups thinking along as they got to see each other's questions and connections happening. So those strategies were implemented during the task, and then the last 5 minutes was dedicated to closing the task. And the professor here was trying to take the things that showed up on the whiteboards or that the instructional team heard during class to highlight them as brilliant scientific thinking and to connect them to the things that chemists are doing. So for example, one thing that she said was, you guys are asking great questions that are getting me to think in different ways. And the point of framing this would be to say that not only are questions important, but science is not this static thing that has one correct way of thinking, right? That actually we need different perspectives in it. We have a lot of learning, we think, to do here still. Part of our job is to support our undergraduate TAs and our GSIs and us as researchers and professors to relearn how to interact with students. So certainly we did still have kind of individual teacher scholars interacting with individual students rather than interacting with teams. It was sometimes hard to know what to say, like how to give students enough to go on, but not too much that we were giving away answers. And as we saw in equitable interactions taking place, sometimes it was hard to know how to intervene appropriately because the room is 115 students all speaking, and so it was pretty loud. So thinking about different ways of doing that still. I don't know if I should pause again, Rolf, for some questions.
I think there look like there's some.
There are a number of questions have come up since the last pause.
Okay.
The first one is, what are racial microaggressions? You mentioned them earlier, and somebody would like to know maybe an example of what that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the lecture class, there's clicker questions happen, and so there's a time where students are supposed to turn to one another and share answers. And a lot of our Black women talked about having answers that were correct, but having them completely ignored, and then they would notice students turning to each other saying the same answer, and then that answer would get validated. And so that's a racial microaggression because it's an assumption about someone based on their race or a gender.
And it's acting on those assumptions.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, how do you discuss concepts without knowing the terminology?
So if we think about, for example, entropy, right? Some of the ways that we talk about entropy in the course are just, that it's about dispersion, right? And things moving around. I think you can talk, instead of having to know the word entropy, right? We want them to know what entropy means. And then we can talk, then we can say this, this thing that you wrestled with, that's entropy. Or, for example, polarity, right? Where we're having an unequal distribution of charges. We want students to talk about unequal distribution of charges before they actually have to know to be able to use polarity, right? So that we can be sure that they understand what these concepts are and not that they're just getting lost in jargon, right? Because it's really easy to use jargon to mask misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you. The next question is, I think you may have answered it. Are students given a specific role during this task? I think you talked about the team. Are the other members of the group all equal?
Yeah, at this point we only have a team leader, so we haven't done any other assignments of roles. We've talked about it amongst ourselves to figure out if it could support more equitable engagement. But outside of the team leader, all other students are like.
Yeah. The next question, or I guess it's a comment, that is this similar to the POGL format? How is this different or similar to POGL?
Mm-hmm. Aspects are similar. POGL is, right, engaging students in data. I think we tried to think about formatting that data in ways that would allow students to sort in different ways, to try out multiple ways of seeing. And I think we tried to think a lot more about the social supports around how do we message what science is in more inclusive ways, and then what does it look like to actually support that interaction in class.
Okay. The next question is, I know this implementation is in a non-majors course. I'm curious whether any of these strategies, approaches will be implemented in majors courses.
So we're not entirely sure. So that we're clear, the iteration that we're talking about right now was what we did in fall 16. In fall 2017, the course actually did include, I think, 8 chemistry majors. So it could just as easily be implemented in a majors course.
Yeah.
And honestly, the difference between our majors and non-majors course here at Berkeley has to do with, so for chemistry majors, their general chemistry is 2 semesters. We're squeezing everything into 1. And I think they go in a little bit more in depth, obviously, for the chemistry majors.
Right. Okay. Then the next question is, how did you create the teams initially? Was that controlled or random? Were you trying to construct the teams?
Yeah, we sent out a Google form. We were interested in whether students were identifying as more extroverted or introverted, because we didn't want the introverts to kind of get lost in a sea of extroverts. This was just something we tried out. And we also wanted to group any returning students. So we had a couple students who had failed the class. We had a lot of students, sorry, not our class, but the large lecture class. And students who had started out in the large lecture course and had dropped, and so they were retaking chem. So we wanted to put any returning students together so that they felt a sense of community and not isolated in that. We also changed teams, I think, twice during that semester, and because after that initial team formation, because we got to know some of the students, when we changed teams, we tried to do some social organization to try to support students that we thought needed more support to engage, or for students who we found even if in the beginning they seemed to be, via this Google form, that they might have been more introverted, that they might be more extroverted. So we tried to group those students together.
Okay. Last question. Could you please repeat the number of teachers, TAs, and LAs? Is there a training session for them beforehand for each class, or any other form of training?
That's a great question.
So there's 1 professor. There are 2 graduate student instructors, and these are for this particular semester, they were 2 first-year chemistry grad students. And then we had 7 undergraduate TAs who were a part of a program that exists in the College of Chemistry called Teacher Scholars. And as a part of that program, they do get some pedagogical training. Because obviously the structure of our course is vastly different than the structure of most courses that these students are working with, we did, at the beginning of the semester, we did a training with all of them to try to introduce our thinking and our approach to the class. Also, at the beginning, for the first 5 minutes after the task launch, for the first 5 minutes that students were engaging in the task, Erin and I actually took the teacher scholars and GSIs into the hallway to get any questions that they may have had about a given task. It also provided us an opportunity to ask if they noticed any issues happening within their groups or with particular students. And then for what this meant for what was happening in the class was that students got to be engaged in the task very quickly, because as we all probably know, a lot of times students will, the hand goes up before they've ever really given themselves a chance to engage in something.
Okay. Next question. How did the students take the changing of the groups? Was there resistance from them?
A lot of students were really sad that we changed the groups. They had built a lot of love and community, and they were waving at each other from across the room. But then, of course, other groups that weren't functioning quite as well, students welcomed the change. In interviews, they had suggested that they would have liked to have known ahead of time that we would be changing so that they knew what to expect.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to move on, and we'll pick up at the last question later.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so now that we've talked about what was happening in class and how that was structured, and we're going to talk briefly about lecture. And lecture was made available to students after class, and our goals with lecture was really to build on and expand what students were learning in the tasks during class. So these were pre-recorded video lectures that students could access via B Courses, which is our Canvas platform here at Cal. And the goals for these lectures were to review the task a bit, to introduce formal chemical language, right? So as we were just talking about, right, they're wrestling with all of these concepts and to gain understanding of these concepts. But now, because formal chemical language is important, we need to map words onto them. onto these concepts. Also, trying to create connections between what they've just learned and between what they've just learned and to concepts that they've learned previously, and finally trying to provide some relevant context to these new ideas. For example, these slides are from the intermolecular force lecture. So one way that we try to make intermolecular forces relevant, because many of our students are interested in health and our biology intended, was to talk about how hydrogen bonds hold DNA together. So next we'd like to talk about assessments. And we really needed to be diligent in how we designed assessments, because we did so much work to support students to understand the importance of practices. And if we just created standard assessments, a lot of that work would be in vain. So we wanted to be sure to design assessments that were assessing both content and practices. So to do that, students actually took a weekly quiz, and then we had 4 exams. So there were 3 midterms at the end of the first 3 units and a cumulative final. And obviously we wanted these exams and these quizzes to be about central ideas and practices. And so to do that, similar to what we did with the task, we started with data, and we had students start with data. And then we created an interrelated set of questions that would require students to engage in the same types of practices that we have them doing in the task. So for example, here we had multiple choice questions, other questions that asked students to draw structures, short answer questions that required students to write arguments and justified arguments based on the data given. So in addition to our quizzes and exams and homework, which we don't have time to talk about, we also created what we call the Communicating Science Project. This was a way for us to foreground science communication as an important scientific practice, a way for us to, again, engage students in thinking about some of these central ideas and making connections, and to leverage student strengths and experiences. So this project, at the beginning of the semester, students chose either a hormone or a toxic metal salt as a means of creating some relevance for all of this. And they had to explain the chemistry of these compounds to 2 audiences. One, the classroom community, and in writing posts for this audiences, they were required to use formal scientific language that we've learned thus far. And the second, to help support students' fluency in science communication, they had to write a post to their friends and family. And this was, for this one, they were required to use informal language. We encouraged the use of slang. We encouraged the use of languages that were not English, but students were required, if they chose to use any science words, they were required to define them. And finally, students had the opportunity to review their peers, which for many students, they talked about how important that was. A, because it gave them an opportunity to see how other people approached writing these posts, and because they'd never done it before. They'd never had to think about how to critically review someone's work. So here's an example of some student work. And so this was from Unit 4, which is focused on spectroscopy, and a prompt that asked students to teach their audiences about how they could use spectroscopy to learn about the chemistry of their compound, or a portion of their compound. This student's compound was mercurius chloride. So for the classroom community, they talked about photoelectron spectroscopy. And these are just brief snippets of the full post. Sorry, this Zoom is kind of distracting. But on the left, for the classroom community, they're discussing Coulomb's attractions and how that dictates which electrons are easier to remove. And what they're doing for the friends and family posts is they're using this picture with Joey from Friends, for those who are familiar, using him being layered in all of these clothes as an analogy for the same concept. So challenges. Because we don't repeat questions year to year, trying to find relevant and interesting and accessible data is very, very challenging. And for the communicating chemistry work, one thing that we learned from students is that many of our substances, the chemistry was way too complicated for what we needed them to do, or were asking them to do, and not all of the substances worked well for all units. And so we can take some more questions now, if there are any.
There's one more question. A clarification did I understand correctly that UCB pre-med majors take 1 semester general chemistry, then go on to take OChem? I think that's what you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That's it right now.
Okay.
Go on.
Okay, great. So participating in new practices might not yet be enough to disrupt some of these kind of traditional views about science and competence. And so we wanted to design some reflections that would give students space to make sense of their own experiences in relationship to these new ideas. So we identified 5 skills that we thought were central to doing science, but that might not normally be perceived as such. And these skills are listed on the screen. And so we had students choose one per unit, so they did this 4 times, and they would reflect on a series of questions that were crafted in a way that allowed us to kind of define what that skill meant. So here you see, when I struggle, I remind myself that encountering setbacks is a normal part of the work of scientists. And there were other spaces in these reflections to kind of make sense of their participation. We then read all of their responses and crafted some public feedback for them in order to both publicize and normalize their concerns. So we say things like, many of you said you're feeling nervous about holding your team back because of asking questions. And then we connect that concern back to science, right? By saying that actually wrestling with ideas or struggling in these ways are productive and a normal part of doing science. And we also would identify, right, both the professor, graduate students, and researchers would identify with feeling these same things. In addition, we called out students' strengths. We gave them a list of strengths and areas of growth that they had named in these reflections. And reminded them that the work that they're taking on is intellectually challenging. It's probably some of the hardest work they've had to do since leaving high school. So we would point them to resources. Finally, at the end of the class, we crafted a course reflection that asked them to think about these 2 prompts. First, how have your ideas about chemistry learning and about what it takes to think like a chemist either been changed, challenged, or confirmed this semester? And that gave us a really good sense of how all of these kind of strategies and how this whole system we had implemented, how it was working, and gave them a sense to also reflect on that.
I guess before we get to this last bit, we should maybe take, if there are any questions, we could take them now. For the last
yeah, there is one question. Actually, there's 2.
Okay.
How did you prepare to assess friends and family explanations in the possible variety of languages?
Oh, so we did, for students who who wrote in other languages, we did ask for a translation. Yeah. Because we're not polyglots.
And then the last question, I think, is asking, would it be possible to have your slides after the talk, if that's possible? That's up to you. This whole, I should tell everyone, I'm recording this whole thing, and it'll be on our YouTube channel, and you can go to our website and see it, and I will probably email that link to everybody who registered. Okay.
All right. So as we wrap up, we'd just like to talk briefly about some findings and our reflection. Okay, but throughout the semester, we collected data about students, because we really, we're reorganizing this entire system. We need to understand what's happening for them. So to do that, we collected video data as students were engaging in tasks. We collected pre and post survey data to gain some understanding about some of the psychosocial aspects of the course. At the end of the semester, we did interviews with 24 students, and we also have the opportunity to look at student work like the reflections and communicating chemistry, etc., to help us make sense of how students are making sense of things. So I just want to remind you, right, that our goal is to create this space that supports students to develop a rich and connected and relevant understanding of chemistry, and a learning experience that supports students to recognize their own brilliance. And what we see from our preliminary findings is that we're moving towards this goal. So from video data collected from 10 tasks with multiple groups, and we had about 350 minutes of data, what we see is that students are actually engaging in scientific practice as they're engaging in these tasks. So they're doing things like identifying patterns, they're asking questions, they're justifying their statements with data. From the survey data, we see these statistically significant positive shifts in how students are relating to science. So we see positive shifts in how, them saying, I am good at science, feeling a connection with the science community, feeling as though being a scientist is an important part of who they are. And finally, from interview data.
One of the important things that we found is that students are moving away from seeing chemistry learning as about memorizing facts or executing procedures to actually talking about learning as this iterative process of constructing understanding of from data. So they're seeing that what they're doing is basically learning the way that chemists learn. And when we ask students, what does it mean to be good at chemistry? They have much more expansive and inclusive practice-centered definitions of what that means. So they're telling us that, oh, well, what it means is that you can identify patterns, you can make connections, you can develop conclusions, you can revise your conclusions. So really grounding it in practice, which is what we were hoping to see. And we wanted to end by just sharing this quote from a course reflection. A student had said, but before I had this preconceived notion that being a chemist took some form of innate ability or intelligence, right, that it's about getting right answers. And they said, now I see that really thinking like a chemist is about being inquisitive and hardworking and open to new ideas. And this is reflective of something that happened across course reflections. And so what we're seeing is that when we ground competence in scientific practice, students are able to move away from this sense that, oh, it just takes some kind of special brilliance that I don't have to do science.
So finally, we obviously want to say thank you first and foremost, although we forgot to put her on the slide, to Professor Angelica Stacy for providing us the opportunity to do this redesign and to study these students. We'd also like to thank all students who've existed in any iteration of this redesign. So we, this past fall, I guess would technically be sort of the fourth iteration of redesign. So we're deeply grateful for all that we've been able to learn from them. We'd also like to thank the Office of Multicultural Student Development, Nzinga Duga and Lupe Gallegos Diaz, who I think are now no longer at Berkeley, but we'd like to thank them for, my apologies. We'd also like to thank our EOP program, and more specifically Yuki Burton, who has been a wonderful supporter of this redesign, the Office of Registrar for supporting us to find spaces, the College of Chemistry and the Chemistry Library, which gave us space for one of our iterations, and Lucia Briggs, who really facilitates a lot of the early organization. College advisors from engineering, College of Natural Resources and Letters and Sciences, and finally for University of California, Berkeley for funding. And also thank you for registering, for listening, and we can take some questions.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that have popped up. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and let's deal with those questions, and then I have a couple of questions as well. The first question is, there was no knowledge skills test at the end that would allow you to objectively measure how students in this group performed in comparison to the usual class. So the question is, did you do any measurement of performance in the different versions of Chem 1A on similar content, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, we had tried and considered it, but no, we have not yet done that.
Mm-hmm. I guess the follow-on question I had, and I'll just inject myself into it, have you done any follow-on evaluation of those students and what happens like when they move on to OChem? Is there any, have you done the data analysis as they leave your course and go into the next Chem course? Is that, do you have any data on how they're doing?
So we don't directly have that data, but it is available, and it's something that we are intending to look at because it exists as institutional data, and there is someone who does some of that analysis on campus. So we, have been, as partnerships happen on campus, where it's like, we really need to do this thing, we should work together, we're excited about working together, but then everybody has 1,000 things to do.
I totally understand.
Yeah, it is something that we're intending to do or to
learn. The next question is, so grades were based on individual tests, not group interactions. And then the second part of that question is, did the racial spread of grades differ from the prior course? So was there a difference in the URM performance in your course versus, let's say, the traditional 1A course?
So in terms of thinking about performance, we have not looked at how performance itself, in terms of thinking about grades, is distributed amongst different racial ethnic groups. For the survey data, like that's some information that we have, but it doesn't talk about grades. In terms of, I guess one of the things that we think about are students dropping or withdrawing from our course, and what we see in sort of broad strokes is that students are not leaving our course at the same rates that they're leaving the larger one. But again, that's something that we could access via institutional data.
Right, right. Let's see, we have another question. Did I hear correctly that you redefine brilliance as being engaged in the scientific practice? If so, what do you think was the effect of this redefinition to students who are significantly higher performing than the average? So that's a question sort of questioning the definition of brilliance.
I mean, I do think, we're still thinking about this. I haven't done any particular analysis about it, but I do think for students who have learned kind of the rules of looking smart and have been really successful in kind of traditional courses, I think it was hard for them to kind of let go of that way of being and that way of learning. So yeah, we had some students who kind of were really pushing back against these new definitions of brilliance and just told us in interviews, like, this society cares about grades, and that's what I care about.
Well, because ultimately for them, right, thinking, I guess, a couple of students in particular who performed well in the course, but perhaps were expecting A+, right? And because these students are pre-meds at a very competitive institution, they're thinking about, ultimately, med school is going to look at this thing, right? They're not going to care whether or not I know practices. They want to know about grades. And it's hard to redefine that and in a semester, especially because most of the students in this class, outside of the repeaters, are freshmen.
The next question is, could you please clarify again how students were graded?
Oh, so the grades were they had homework every day. So that was a small part of the grade. Exams were still, unfortunately, a huge percentage of their grades, and also the communicating science project and
served as about the same weight as one exam.
As one exam, yeah.
So we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna ask if anybody wants me to turn on their webcam and ask questions or make comments about what the topic from today. I think that would be something we could do now. Is anybody, you can raise your hand, you can find, if you move your cursor, I believe there's maybe the more option, you can raise your hand and I can promote you to be a panelist and contribute what you think or have any ideas on anything. Any brave people out there willing to have their webcam turned on? Well, in the meantime, while waiting for hands to raise, I have a question. I wondered, I guess I'll turn on my video cams. So I'm not a disembodied person. Okay, so the question I have is, what about the people that have been teaching Chem 1A in the traditional way for many years, probably at Berkeley, and are they checking in on what you're doing? Do you think you're going to have an impact on the way they're teaching? Maybe they'll do a little bit of some of this. I mean, the entire package is a huge commitment for most faculty. I would have to say, that's my first impression listening to this. And I teach intro bio with 700 students, so I'm pretty familiar with the traditional way of teaching 700 students. So the question is, do you think there are chem faculty who are teaching in those large lecture halls who are going to take some part of what you're doing and integrate it into their Chem 1A?
So we haven't been in direct conversation with all of the people who currently teach the large lecture for Chem 1A. I know that some of them are faculty, some of them are lecturers. And we have done some thinking about the fact, like we recognize that this is a lot to do. It's a lot, and there's 3 of us, right? And for most people,
Right.
it's just you. So I think as we move forward and try to think about how to maintain Section 4, but also make these, our redesign course, and also these larger sections, to create a different environment or a more supportive environment for them, we do need to sit down and have those conversations. But ideally, there are small things that we think that people could take up, especially just trying to think about how you talk about practices and what you say to students, because so much of what's happening for underrepresented students is about those social interactions.
Right, right. Well, somebody briefly raised their hand and then they put it down. Whoops, here it is. Okay, promote you, Kalju. I'll promote you to, I think I just promoted Kalju, and I'm going to turn on your, let's see. I think your mic is turned off. All right, maybe I have to unmute you.
Let me try.
There you go, you're on.
Thank you. So I have more like a student success question. I am teaching organic chemistry and biochemistry classes, and some of them are online classes, and they are open to all UC students. And with those upper level classes, I have a fairly firm expectation that people who have passed general chemistry classes would know how to do elementary calculations, could distinguish between Coulomb interaction and dipole-dipole interaction and London dispersion things, and know how to calculate the pH of their weak acids, have kind of a set of quantitative things where if I give them a chemistry problem that involves in the first part some elementary chemistry 1 calculations, they can easily do that and move to the more difficult part. Would you say that the students who went through your program, the pre-chem majors or the pre-med people I oftentimes see, are they well equipped to tackle those type of upper level classes?
We think so. I think central to thinking about what we wanted to teach them in terms of content and practice was deliberately to prepare them for their organic chemistry courses. And so a lot of those procedural things got covered in lecture. In our most recent iteration this past fall, we created readers that also had sections that allow students to practice how to do those calculations.
Okay, cool. Well, send them my way if they need it.
We tried to set students to really make sense of what those equations or those relationships were. Sometimes we tried to have them drive the rules or the relationships between the variables before we would introduce what the was.
Okay,
thank you.
Any other brave individuals willing to raise your hand, have a question? I'm looking at the list of participants here, waiting. We'll give you a minute to think about what your question might be. Nope, nothing so far. We'll give them another minute. Maybe somebody will raise their hand. Let me see, I was writing, some of the questions I had actually have already been asked. So what would it, I guess we kind of talked a little bit about this, but what would it take to scale out to 2 sections of this course? Would you have to double everybody, or is there some economy of scale as you go up to a larger number of sections?
Mm-hmm. So I would say we probably have the grad students for it in terms of the GSIs. And I think, so the undergraduate students who are serving as TAs are a part of the Teacher Scholar program. I don't remember if we said this already.
Yeah, you did.
And so I think, they tend to have more students apply than they have spaces for in classrooms. So, if we had more Teacher Scholars and someone else, an additional instructor or an instructor designated
right.
for this redesign section.
I think all of the work has gone into task design, right? Designing those lectures and then grading. And so once you have the curriculum, I think that makes it easier to scale. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, we do a mentoring program in our bio class with undergraduates, and we have a pretty infinite supply of undergraduates volunteering to do that. We don't pay them. It's volunteer.
Yeah.
And so it's a resource that UC has, a large number of undergraduates who at the senior level are very capable of being excellent learning assistants. That's what I've found. And
students,
we need to tap into that source.
Yeah, and the students in the courses really, really adore the teacher scholars. I think they might be their favorite, second favorite perhaps to Professor Stacy.
Of course.
Yeah, no, because students have called her what, motivational speaker, a cheerleader.
Right. And I think the students doing the mentoring or teaching get a lot out of it.
Yes.
In my experience, it's one of their top experiences as an undergraduate, what they would tell me. So we need to, as a UC as a whole, we need to utilize that more. Let's see, a couple of questions just showed up. You can turn off your sharing and pull up the question, and you'll see the questions yourself. I see them because I have two screens, but if you stop sharing your screen and pull up the Q&A button, you'll see all the questions.
Okay. All right, answer open. Okay, is the section of Gen Chem that students had to opt into, was participation voluntary? Yeah, so participation was voluntary. We advertised to across campus, but we're also fairly defined in defined ways. So we advertise with EOP, we advertise with specific advisors in various colleges. But students' participation wasn't required. Like they didn't have to take the class, but especially as word got out, a lot of students wanted to take the class.
The next question is, do your exams, you say that quote unquote, unfortunately, still make up a large percentage of the final grade? Do they differ significantly from the traditional course? So the exams that we give, Professor Stacy has been giving this same kind of exam in her courses for the last few decades, but they do tend to be different than the exams that are crafted by other professors, which perhaps are more multiple choice based. I think this past semester it was all multiple choice, the exam questions, and some of them are more quantitative focused and less conceptual. So I think our exams do differ in that way.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've gone a minute over the promised hour, and I think unless there's one more question, I think we're done. And I really, really appreciate your willingness to do this, and I thank you a lot. Okay, and I thank all the viewers who clicked in and participated. So with that, I'm going to end this meeting and say goodbye. And we'll have if anybody has a topic or they know of somebody at their campus that would be wanting to give a presentation, willing to get about effective STEM education, email me and I'll contact them and ask them if they're willing to do this.
Okay.
Thank you. Whoops, I think we got one more question.
Oh.
Yep. One more. Did you say your
no?
Multiple choice
exams have multiple choice questions, but answering those questions requires data, like students to be engaged with the data related to that question. What Erin said was that from this past semester, those exams for the traditional course were all multiple choice based.
Right. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
All right. Thank you. Oh.